Hello everyone, today we talk about an old acquaintance of ours, one of the most important commanders in Western history, and a figure that truly incarnates the highest principles of chivalry, of crusade, of dedication to the Holy Roman Empire. We're talking about Prince Eugene, or Eugenio von Savoy, as he signed himself, as we will see later. In the early days of Schwerpunkt, we were in 2019, 2020, 2021, we started a series about Prince Eugene that I decided at some point to cancel and that I actually want to resume soon, right? It will officially re-enter the branch, but starting it from scratch for so many different reasons that we will analyze now. If anything, today is a day of Catholic culture spreading in the world with the election of Pope Leo XIV. And the Catholic meaning of Prince Eugene and his life is something often, if not underrated, at least mostly contextualized, as this was just the Austrian boy, right, as opposed to Marlborough as the best of England at Similia, right? This is actually not quite suited to the divide that existed in Europe at the time as far as also traditional views are concerned. I will not spoiler what I'm preparing. I have essentially some special that will talk surely about Prince Eugene more comprehensively. I also have it on Montecuccoli just for make you understand where I come from with this imperial tradition and continuity. Today we talk about Prince Eugene as far as his participation to the siege of Vienna is concerned, right? This was his baptism of fire. By the way, there's also the famous Prince Eugen de Adelreta tells, as a proof of loyalty, not just to the empire, to Catholicism in the great struggle against the Turk, but also to vindicate his brother Louis, who had fallen by Carnuntum, that is today called Petronell Carnuntum. It's not just a very famous Roman archaeological site. There's a beautiful reconstructed camp there on the Danube. But in fact, after that skirmish that brought to the death of Eugene's elderly brother during the battle, let's say the siege at that point of Vienna, as basically this was happening in the outskirts of the city against the Ottomans. There is a veritable mythology and almost occult esotericism about his figure at so many levels of European tradition, especially as far as the militaria are concerned. That so many different warships were called from so many different European countries after Prince Eugene. There is truly a meaning, a shared meaning of traditional belonging in the figure of Prince Eugene that works truly as a bridge between cultures that were in fact very different at some point, as for example were divided by confession, also by national competition among each other. So looking at this figure, the tomb of which is in the St. Stephen Dome in Vienna, that unfortunately can't be visited. At least I don't think it is possible ever when I go there. It's really not possible. Unfortunately, you can see it from the distance. However, really makes you wonder about how much we could learn from Prince Eugene, because in fact I think the only video that I still have uploaded on Schwerpunkt about Prince Eugene is titled "What the West Can Learn from That." It's a pretty heated video, unlike the ones I've come now to mostly make, because it's an attack, also a criticism to how people basically misunderstand European and Catholic identity at large, and I've become more patient over the years in telling about this topic. And it's also a topic that invests so many different historical contexts already at the time, because as we said before, from Eugene's own signature, because that sort of Italian, French, German mix was literally the language that he spoke, right? And that perfectly incarnates that level of European nobility that did not really fall into a specific nationalistic boundary, but in fact encompass a truly holy, imperial, and Catholic meaning that most people from quite a while have already forgotten. In fact, those ships titled after him in the 19th and 20th century already belonged to a later time where these countries believed something about themselves that, in fact, would have difficultly been accepted by the same Prince Eugene. He really deserves a biographic series, and that's, again, what I'm planning to resume. The connection with the Battle of Vienna is also fascinating because to an extent, to say if you had photographed it from a time, it would have just been anecdotal, right? Prince Eugene didn't do anything special during the battle. He basically cleared some Ottoman trenches after the main clash had basically destroyed the Turkish army. But of course, as baptism of fire is so very much connected as the beginning, as a sort of a holy anointing, as a rebirth, right, of the military man that many would have, including Louis XIV, the Sun King, would have not really thought he could and would have become. Much to, in fact, the King of France, chagrin, as we will see later. Chagrin mostly towards himself for having self-admittedly lost that enormous chance, also because of all the French blood that would be shed during the coalition wars against France. Like the partnership between Marlborough and Eugene is also very famous. I made a video about the Battle of Malplaquet if you're interested, but we really have to get into that. I'm also planning something about Marlborough, looking also at a bit like the Wars of the Three Reigns. We get a bit more British and Irish at some point. I want to talk Monroe's. I want to talk the Battle of Bamberg at Similia. We also have to resume the series about the English Civil War, but it's really plenty of that kind of shared nobiliar identity that made us Europeans back then, and of course much before. So it's difficult to, like, especially because I don't talk, as I've just told you, about Prince Eugene from quite a while, and I discovered, to some disappointment, that many people, it's not like they don't know Prince Eugene. There's plenty of videos out there. He was popularized, especially I think in the last decade on YouTube, to the degree that maybe if he didn't deserve, like, in the sense that much more should be always said about him, at least made it knowledgeable. There are some people that, for example, do not know anything about Montecuccoli. Sometimes, once I remember, it was years ago, a follower said, "Oh my God, I knew about Turenne, but Montecuccoli, what is that? I mean, how can you know something about Turenne, where literally the most important campaigns fought by Turenne were the ones against Montecuccoli that became so much like a strategic basis, as basis for strategic didactic education for basically all commanders coming after them, or it's something very difficult, because we have really lost that sense of not just pan-European and, in fact, Catholic culture, but properly the notion of locating these figures in their respective contexts. You know that as an expert of the art of war, I focus very much on the notion that this is not just military history per se, and war in general are specific subjects on their own that you shouldn't simply study in function of society or economic, whatever you've been told that war is just worth studying for, mostly from a culturalistic or structuralistic or even worse perspective. But indeed, you cannot understand history or politics or society if you do not know all the others at the same time. So this doesn't mean war actually is, is the is I would say the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity. But in this sense, it's really something on its own, with a dignity that is as high as the one of politics and society. And without being able to contextualize these commanders in their history, in their background, in their beliefs, in their ideologies, it's practically impossible even to understand the military history of it. And I fear that In fact, even the military aspect of it is popularized in a self-servient way rather than one that really extends to a broader picture, right? So, 1683, the announcement of the Turkish siege of Vienna cast naturally a shadow, dread, and ignited essentially a fervent blaze of indignation and zeal across Europe, right? We made videos describing the devastations that the Ottomans carried out, their approach, the swarms of the Tatar horsemen that, like locusts, plundered, ravaged the land. We've seen like the departure of the same Habsburgs, the same Leopold Emperor from Vienna in in a sort of collective incredulity, the saying that the Habsburgs, also for practical purposes, wanted to show like the siege is not going to happen until the last. They almost got captured by the Tatars, by the way. It was just the much hated French ambassador that actually managed to create with his servants a barricade with his coach across the Danubian bridge to prevent the Tatars to literally kidnap the Habsburg court. They ended up in Passau, upriver, in Bavaria, at the border with Austria. And as you know, this was a place where so many refugees were flowing from the entire, in this sense, southeastern German world and even beyond, because of the Turkish onslaught. This is the moment in which you would have seen Prince Eugene, that was not Prince Eugene yet, among, in fact, the many aristocratic youth of Europe, including Protestant one. This is interesting, because many, of course, Protestant princes were just like watching the same French as Catholics, as you know, were almost supporting the Turk covertly in the process, perfectly aware of the broader implications, but just to possibly like harm the Habsburg as much as possible. And yet the youth of those Protestant princes was so excited by the ultimately lay underpinning traditional Catholic struggle against the Turks, the Holy War, the Crusade, that they would actually run to fight in Vienna. There was properly a regiment that was created for them, to which also the same, and poor, by the way, Prince Eugene at the time was would participate. It's a long story because Prince Eugene's history is again so incredibly fascinating, and telling us a story also not of a typical Middle-European figure, but a guy who was literally brought up in Versailles, and that had in Paris some of the most, if you want, modern secular, for how modern secular the world could be at the time, but surely more compared to Central Europe experience of, in fact, also the greatest imperium available at the time, like, the French one, and that decided to change world, and that decided to abandon France and to start serving the Holy Roman Empire, right? It's difficult to explain. Like, one could see it with modern events, but imagine being like in that late 17th century Europe and, feeling that profound yet diverse intensity of indignation and zeal at the same time, right? How motivated you can be to fight against an invader, considering the pride that comes with that, but also the fear, the sense of harm, and the unpredictability of it all, right? And that's where Prince Eugene becomes also more relatable in this part of this youth. In part, as we will see, considering his background and the fact that he really needed that chance, and this event almost took on a metaphysical meaning for him, as for many people at the time, right? Were we to describe Prince Eugene, we'll probably never end. Like, there are different ways, however, that can render a part of the idea. The remarkable figure can be seen as an emblem of the finest Western Christian knighthood, still well alive in that period, drawn eastward over centuries in successive surges, as if pulled by an irresistible force towards the Orient, or rather against the Orient. I think this is incredibly important in this sense, in the most traditional aspect of modernity. That I always say that I don't believe that the modern era existed, but there is a part of it that we're unavoidably within, that does have to do with the constant threat that the West somehow suffered, although always in a victorious fashion, in dealing with the East, right? And the East here is not more, of course, we're talking the Ottomans, that, as you know, weren't just Turks, they weren't just even Muslims. There were Christian forces fighting in Vienna against the Habsburgs, the Poles, and all the people that had come there. And so there is something incredibly actual, I think, in the choice that Prince Eugene was making, right? It's as if you have, regardless of the frustrations we will see now, actually a pretty easy life in Paris, right? You have the means to sustain yourself, at least to a level that most people in Europe at the time could not even dream to afford. You basically abandon everything, risking to die just to go to fight for this great cause in the East, and feeling the call, unlike even the greatest imperium wielder we're talking about, the Sun King would have actually allowed, and actually in contrast with that too. So a threat coming from the East, but also possibly a greater threat that is indifference, or even worse, like manipulation, coming from within the West, that perfectly embodies like the choices that we seem to be making today when looking at the world. And Prince Eugene is also a great personal example, like even as a man, right? Because notoriously enough, in physical stature, he was unassuming. He was short, delicate, and unremarkable in appearance. His image was not enhanced by the lofty late Baroque wigs with central partings that court artists insisted on portraying him in, accompanied by the polished steel of armor, a martial staff in a prancing with charger. Right, these embellishments likely exacerbated his modest presence, because you can actually see in the paintings, regardless of the grace of the author, that the author wanted to bestow on this portrait, that he didn't look particularly good, right? And this is also very famous for many reasons. But this is also actually touching on an aspect of the traditional meaning of Catholic providence. That is to say, the outer appearance of this world is not never random, right? But it shows you the value of redemption, right? I am the first one to celebrate beauty, power, health, etc. This does have a metaphysical relevance. But aside from the fact that as mortals, we tend to lose these things over the years, you can look at people that are actually not born with these attributes, most of the times realizing that are actually pretty grievous and, angry with life, and in fact self-destructive in many ways, and remaining there. And in the case instead of a nobleman like Prince Eugene, like even a greater, let's say, honor, like a greater source of pride, considering in fact the obstacle that he had to surpass regarding his sickling constitution, right? In fact, within this slight and awkward frame dwelt a brilliant military strategist, a fearless whirlwind of warfare, a magnanimous patron, by the way, and a discerning lover of the arts, right? His noble spirit embodied the essence of a true chevalier chrétien, an authentic prince charmant. He could have not been, hadn't he been properly a sum of both, right? The more ancestral original meaning of Christian knight, and the one of a charming prince in the sense of also of charisma and really imbalance that he incarnated in the way he handled himself. Some people are also better understood through their characters, that at some point we'll come to learn. Prince Eugene was quite ethereal, quite balanced, quite sort of capable of maintaining control in the most dreadful of situations, but knowing exactly how to play all the instruments at his disposal in a great concert. I will not here list some of his greatest successes, but I mean the siege of Belgrade, in 1717. Like it's just something that you can't just unappreciate. We will talk about Zenta, we'll talk about the siege of Turin, for not talking about, of course, Flanders, etc. In any case, the identity of this figure, as I was saying before, is really unmistakable for every Westerner. Right? You're not really a Westerner if you've never heard of Prince Eugene, or you don't know what his true deal was. Eugene was Savoy Carignano-Soissons. He descended from Charles V. By the way, this is very interesting through like a female line, but mostly also through the Savoy male one. And he would become known as Prince Eugene. You understand that, for example, he never made much of his figure simply like the connection with Charles V. But these were noblemen that were just habituated to express their own identity through the knowledge of their ancestry. All the other noblemen recognized that was nothing to prove, but being at the center of that. Like, this is not exactly the same in the sense that, of course, all noblemen had to prove something in their life at some point, but it was so natural to do so that it seemed really, something you didn't have even to be surprised of. But of course, Prince Eugene was unique in this, not just because of the difficulties that were pointed out before he had to overcome regarding his physical aspect and properly physical fitness to warfare, but actually much more in terms of a psychomagic rapport with the greatest figure in Europe at the time, the Sun King, that was in a sense working as his own, in that sense, missing fatherly figure. All right, at least because, as we will see now, Prince Eugene's father died relatively early on, and the early life of Prince Eugene was very much connected to important female figures in his life, his mother, his grandmother as well. There is a charm that is part of the great vision of Baroque culture in general, like the idea, still typical of the 16th or 17th century, that the world was not just like we intended today, mostly from the 18th century, the Enlightenment, that Prince Eugene in that sense did not embrace, first of all, for chronological limits, but more than else tied to, in fact, the Mytho-European context of specialization, of categorization. And these were minds that were trained as noblemen to embrace the entire knowledge in a way or another. A luminary of Europe, Prince Eugene was a proud and self-aware heir to a distinguished heritage. As we said before, he frequently signed his name Eugenio von Savoy, so literally stressing his Italian, German, and French background, weaving together, in fact, the linguistic threads of his three ancestral homelands. And this is very important, given also those question and answer videos we made recently. Not much for the author of those questions, but anyone who's still, to sort out essentially what national identities were considered like in this traditional, still very traditional, almost medieval period. Italy, the geographic and cultural origin of his mother. France, where he was born, took his first steps and embraced the language he deemed his true Muttersprache, so French, as a matter of fact, which, say, was also a bit the deal of the Savoy to begin with. In fact, his branch was probably the Savoy Carignano, as we will see now. These were a branch of the ruling house of Piedmont, Savoy, and less German itself, but the broader Holy Roman Empire, like its crown, though nominally elective, securely grasped by the Habsburg eagle's claws since the late 15th century, as we know. But in this sense, in fact, a truly ecumenic empire transcending the merely German boundaries, its influence, in fact, stretching over Catholic Slavic territories, northern and central Italy, and the Balkan-Danubian regions that were, in fact, the most turbulent, and the ones that the Habsburgs also, and especially later, be under the leadership, the command of Prince Eugene would largely fall into the hands of the Habsburgic Empire. This aspect is also radically relevant because we're talking territories that, again, literally stretched from Friuli to Galicia, right? So an incredibly articulated territory with, say, territories in between that belong, for example, to the crown of Hungary, Transylvania, Ruthenia, etc. And then we'll see that Prince Eugene at some point would easily travel during his political, not just military affairs within, in fact, this enlarging Habsburgic Empire, right? Also, this is pretty notorious, but Prince Eugene was the greatest commander that the Habsburgs ever had. Pretty meaningful enough, he was not a German. But this is in many ways the truest meaning of that sense of synthetic allegiance, where different national and cultural backgrounds come together in something that is deeply transcending and capable, in fact, of expanding a power that is not really understood as just one national power, but in fact a universal imperial one. Prince Eugene's legacy is revered today, at least as far as people remember, at least people with some trace of culture left, especially in the nations that claim the same Prince Eugene's legacy, at least in figure, as their own, right? For example, in Germany, Prince Eugene's memory endured even during the nationalist socialist era, a regime generally hostile to royal descendants, by the way. And just think about framing something called nationalist socialism as something traditional, as a matter of fact. It's a rather post-traditional one. In fact, for different reasons. Not just Germany was not a monarchy or an empire anymore, but it was also historically affirmed over the Habsburgs and against his supporters. And in this sense, also figures tied to European unity, understood at least in that older monarchic fashion, right? Remarkably, an entire SS division, famously enough, was named Prinz Eugen, and one of the Reich's grandest naval cruisers famously bore his name as well. In fact, whether Prince Eugene would have welcomed such honors is uncertain. This is not just about National Socialism per se, but just, as I was saying before, the type of world that had really become, right? Anything nationalistic and or socialistic was completely incoherent with the imperial Catholic tradition that Prince Eugene was fully within, right? The Holy Roman Empire cannot know, right, by definition, just the absolute rule of a nation without an imperial reality above it, even when it's called Reich, but at the end of the day is essentially a nation state of a certain people. Intriguingly, Prince Eugene is also celebrated and respected in the homeland of his greatest enemies, Turkey, right? And we're talking modern Turkey proper. Despite having earned in his lifetime, in fact, the striking sobriquet of Türkenfurcht, right, or terror of the Turks, which he bore with pride and great, merit during his lifetime, to say the least. Prince Eugene was born in Paris on October the 18th, 1663. He was a Libra, hence also, given the astrological interest of the time, he derived most of this sense of balance and equilibrium from. It's ethereal and even sensual, Venus-connected background. After all, he had a hell of an ancestry that would connect him to such aspects that he was able to spiritually elevate himself from during his lifetime, for many reasons, right? First of all, he was not the most important, actually, was the fifth and youngest son, but it was very important given his patrilineal patrician background, but he was the youngest son of Eugene Maurice, Prince of Savoy-Carignano and Count of Soissons. So these were basically Italian-French noblemen, very tied, in fact, to the just born court of Versailles. And in this sense, like the Venus element, the female one, Olympia, daughter of Michele Lorenzo Mancini and Girolama, that was the sister of Cardinal Mazarin, so the Prime Minister of France, one of the single most powerful and influent figures in 7th century politics that, as you know, that work as a father figure to the same Sun King, right, and assisting Anne of Austria during also the minority of Louis and the Fronde, for example. And so this was actually an incredibly turbulent background, enhanced by his familiar occupations to an extent, especially from the female side, and the general still feudal issues that with the Frondes, France was engulfed in still by essentially the end of the 30 Years' War. Among Mazarin's 5 nieces, the Mazarinettes, right, as they were known in Parisian circles, Eugene's mother Olympia was perhaps not the most striking in beauty. In fact, that honor likely belonged to her sister Hortense, 7 years younger, by the way, but undoubtedly the boldest, right? And Versailles, as you know, was a pretty fashioned sort of French milieu and environment. Rumors suggest that the young King Louis the 14th, that was Olympia's exact contemporary, was smitten with her for a while and may have been intimate with her before turning his affections famously enough, to her sister Maria Mancini, who was only a year younger, was basically the greatest love, the youth love of Louis XIV. Right? He was really heartbroken eventually by the raison d'etat that pushed the same Mazzarino to push away his niece, right, not to have her married to the King of France, which naturally would have been a great deal for his own family, but he actually sent her back to Italy at that point, where Louis was literally crazy for her, because as a very strong man of state, Mazarin himself knew that Louis had to marry somebody else. As you know, eventually the Spanish Habsburg, in fact, marriage would be particularly relevant and important also as far as later for the canceling of the Pyrenees, so to say, and that Spanish-French connection that, in a sense, brought also Europe upside down, as the same Prince Eugene would have to cope with during the wars of Spanish succession. You understand how everything is deeply intertwined. It's not really true that Prince Eugene was in any way related to Louis XIV. Regardless, Olympia was rewarded instead with a prestigious marriage to the Savoy-Carignano, that were in fact one of the single most noble families in Europe. Marriage was consumed on February the 2nd, 1657, when she was just 18, and her husband approaching 34 at the time, which was also fairly normal in this age gap. Over the next decade, from 1657 to 1668, the couple welcomed 8 children, which was also pretty appropriate. Following her husband's death in 1673, this was normally a thing, for women especially, getting married very young, and then to usually much older men that tended also to die, especially at the time people passed away, as you know, much more easily. Women risked a lot with labor, etc. In any case, Olympia performed her wifely function, and as a widow retained a position at Versailles, of course at the court, because what was the Sun King's deal, like mostly subsuming like nobiliar power to this cooptation and favoritism connected probably with the physical concentration of all these French families at the court. And Olympia maintained even probably the title of superintendent of the royal household. So you can imagine the power that this woman held. However, as it was also frequent at Versailles, Olympia's fortunes shifted, as in 1680 she was entangled in the notorious Affaire de Poison, a pretty shady deal where basically it seems that the court was theater of some literal poisoning, connection with some sort of black masses, devil worshipping, with connections with some sort of, in fact, proper witches. Like the responsible was put to that at that point, and Olympia was very much connected to this, so that she had to even escape abroad, right, fleeing in exile to Flanders, right. This was actually a big deal. Her fall from grace was apparent, as her earlier connections to the Mazarinette became a liability. So imagine Eugene, that literally, came in, to be in the eye of the storm, at least not as a person responsible to his mother deals. We're talking about like the idea of sacrifices of infants, etc. There is much, the whole truth of this will never be uncovered, but of course there is all a Black Legion, a pretty malignant one behind this. We don't have to be surprised that in a world like Versailles, with all the the center of European power, of spying, this kind of intrigues, envies, ambitions, affairs, such things wouldn't happen. This would, imagine being Eugene, however, and being a kid, a young man, being in between this, right? He had been steered initially toward an ecclesiastical path because his physical appearance would suggest that it would be better suited to an intellectual rather than a physical effort. That this was really normal at the time. There is an instance where Louis the 14th came to visit his mother to basically sleep with her, and entering her apartments there were all the young Savoy Carignano siblings, and apparently Eugene was the ugliest. He had a rabbit's mouth sort of malformation, and Louis XIV, as you know, was quite superstitious, and for example he didn't really like, he looked at Saint Denis from the distance of the Louvre, and he was pretty disturbed by that. So he also moved at Versailles, in part because also of the trauma that he had suffered. As you know, during the Fronde, by the way, Paris was not a very peaceful place, and actually during the same Louis XIV, three distinct chances of actual revolution, like the one that happened later on in 1789-92, could break out. Like we have this idea of at some point the French Revolution. However, in France, revolutions were always a step away from breaking out. The Fronde had been a bit more of a nobiliar thing, but still, like with the strong support of the Parisians. And there is all a story there at some point we made videos about the French wars of religion. That was the sort of say the generations before. Again, we'll get there. And he, by walking across the skids, the king would salute them all, which was also a great honor, right? The king's lovers were, of course, as we've seen just here, provided with great privileges, and even their husbands, depending on, not always were also complacent with that, or like at some point, if these women were widows, the better it was. And Louis, on that occasion, would not salute Eugene, because the toddler looked deformed in the face. And so there is also a bit of gossiping regarding this, that there were some figures at court who really hated him. Also the story, by the way, of libertinism, that Eugene was an homosexual, etc. It's just really bad gossip from political opponents at the court. This mostly women chats that designed especially to damage him, but it's really unlike the libertine lifestyle of those years, especially in Paris, was, as you know, pretty extreme in many ways. And it's true that Prince Eugene went out with these violent gangs that were sometimes seen as also with a sense of brotherly love and connection with one another. But these were the normal associational forms that the nobiliar youth had always had in Europe at the time. And actually, it's really impossible to think that the very rigid and stern and moralistic Habsburgic court of Vienna would have actually embraced, a depraved, a dissolute individual, right? And Eugene was really not. There is really no historical evidence whatsoever that it's true that he wouldn't get married, that he was probably also cold with women to some extent, but it's also like maybe his life experience, as we've seen this early experience at Versailles and other connections, right? In any case, imagine also the trauma, in fact, of being disdained by the king, especially when all your siblings are okay. You're considered like a faulty, like an undeveloped human being. By the way, again, I can't stress enough how important the Savoy Carignano really were at court. Just out of their nobiliar background to begin with, historically, we will talk more about Savoy in general. There were other enemies that Eugene had early on. For example, the sobriquet, the Abbé de Savoie, so the Abbé of Savoy, would always be connected with, in fact, this alleged voices of homosexuality. As he had been also raised after the exile of his mother, that, as we've seen, also was a very strong female figure, under the influence of yet another woman, not actually even a milder one. In fact, Eugene's formidable paternal grandmother, that was Marie of Bourbon-Soissons. So you understand here from which families he descended, right? The Habsburgs, the Savoy, the Bourbon, right? We're talking the greatest nobility in Europe ever, right? Eugene, seeming like everybody was planning his career and trying to sew some clothes on him, the ones of an abbot, but Eugene was really of a very different opinion quite early on, right? He, in fact, harbored ambitions of military renown, akin, by the way, to his father's, that had been a great nobleman, a great chevalier. As we've seen, his slight build, clerical designation, and the king's clear disfavor towards him, also because of all the affair that was on and more, seemed to foreclose Eugene's aspirations. He was sidelined, in part because Louis, who at that point, as you know, was very much in charge of the military, especially from a reformistic point of view, and he was really a great military mind in that organizational sense, not much of a commander at all, but one of the greatest visionaries and enactors of the era, who created properly a national modern army, right, with France becoming the hegemonic power in the continent, allocated the most coveted military roles at his discretion, just like the sun, right, and all the satellites revolving around him, hence Le Roi Soleil. In fact, Eugene was deemed by the king diminutive and unimpressive, right? This was a society in which, again, this was very traditional, in which your physical appearance counted a freaking lot. Because if you were deemed to be of an inferior race with rotten genes, you would not go very, very far. Also because the actual physical strengths and general qualities that you had to be in order to command an army at the time as a nobleman, and all the risks you had to go under were objectively extreme and really deadly, right? And again, we made multiple examples, especially in that video about the Mousquetaires de la Maison du Roi, that are very much connected also to this context. Of course, as we pointed out, this aversion of Louis towards Eugene was exacerbated by the king's lingering bitterness towards Eugene's mother Olympia, that had caused this, in part, like together with other figures, an enormous international scandal, right? And this was, in fact, also fueled by the few aforementioned whispers of her scornful remarks about Louis' youthful infatuation with her. The Mazarinets were quite active at Versailles, let's put it in this way. Imagine that. They had all come from Italy with that enormous, by the way, in fact, importance that the Italian culture had at the French court historically, and with such powerful figures like the same Mazzarino as prime minister. So there was some also French national backlash to this sort of interference. But as you know, some figures were from abroad were even more loyal to the crown, right, and to the État, as it had properly been introduced in European language from 16th century France. And we would have not really seen that enormous power without even this element. Think about Lully, think about all the Italians that were present at the court in Paris and essentially later Versailles. Moreover, it seems that Louis was aware of Eugene's sardonic comments concerning the king's efforts to secure the Holy Roman Empire's throne for his son, the Dauphin Louis, known as the Grand Dauphin, which you would think was just the great Dolphin, right? Because, great is important. This is Louis. Louis' son. Actually, the Grand Dauphin referred to the fact that the Dauphin Louis was notoriously fat, right? And he would actually die. He was born on November the 1st, 1661, and he would die in that terrible year, 1711, for Louis. That really, so basically most of his brother, his descendants, sons, grandsons, dying. The Grand Dauphin died on April the 14th. Otherwise, he was the first in line for royal succession. Instead, as you know, there was basically the Orléans regency, and then you had basically King Louis XV. The Grand Dauphin is also an interesting figure. This was actually a notoriously homosexual. At least, he was both into women and men. But he was also very loved by his brother. In fact, after his passing, it seems that at Louis XIV's court, nobody really laughed anymore. He was an old man anyhow. Because it seems that this brother was more cheerful, and Louis mocked him a little bit because of this role. Notoriously, the brother was known as the Monsieur. Monseigneur, specifically. Regarding the Grand Dauphin, he married Maria Anna Christina Victoria of Bavaria, who passed away a decade later after breeding 3 sons, and that's where you get the link with Louis XV, because the eldest son was Louis of Burgundy, father of the future King Louis XV, while the second Philip, Duke of Anjou, would become King Philip V of Spain, right? So we are really into the 1800s and some of the most, in fact, important ruling figures of this, in fact, Bourbon alliance in Western Europe. But back to Olympia's involvement in the Poison affair. This further undermined Eugene's standing. Consider that this came together with losing income, losing wealth, and regardless of course, his family's inheritance, life especially at Versailles, was quite expensive, right? There were some things the king paid for, but for the rest, if you wanted to maintain yourself there, acquiring posts, titles, etc., you had to pay a big deal for yourself, which was a way that, of course, the Sun King used to control better the nobility. All the stuff we will see at some point in much greater detail in the biographic series about Prince Eugene. Here we just flash the highlights. For example, Eugene reportedly faced hostility from the omnipowerful minister Louvois, who nursed a private resentment himself towards Olympia, whom in fact he had secretly adored, but who had never acknowledged him. Right, the frustration, this incredibly powerful man that, however, could not get some of the most coveted women of the era. Compounding matters, rumors emerged portraying thus Eugene as inclined towards homosexuality. That's how it really began. This bad name came about especially because of the Palatine princess that was notoriously incredibly malevolent, gossiping woman at court that was in fact an opponent of Eugene and crafted these accusations. By the way, there were some Louis of Vendôme, for example, like some actual homosexual commanders, noblemen that also actually displayed incredible badassery on the field when they were. So that the notion again of makeup, wigs, etc., this damoiselle, at court, like would be just weaklings on the battlefield, especially not proper of that era. But more than else, like for us today, like they seem effeminated, right? Louis XIV, for example, excelled in ballet, right? And especially having red shoes with heels was apparently very manly at the time. So it's a completely different world in so many. Virility was not to be challenged by those ideas, but just properly their lifestyle was incredibly brutal, and you can't not really easily understand what was in these people's minds and upbringing was in many ways extremely traumatic and also creating deviations at some point. Even Condé, there is all some kind of gossiping in this regard. But again, for Prince Eugene, it's really made up. There's no proof whatsoever. He was told that he had been dressing in women's clothing. But even so, does that mean that, that makes you homosexual? I don't think so. In any case, this is the most important thing as far as Eugene was concerned. By the early 80s, so more or less around the siege of Vienna of the 17th century, the atmosphere in Paris had grown stifling for the young cleric yearning for a glorious military career. He was still depending on his grandmother regarding his income. He was thus desperate. He could not really afford a living in Versailles, and especially, as we understand here, the death of his brother that had participated to the Habsburgic effort at Carnuntum triggered something in him, right? Later, Louis XIV would rue denying Eugene a military post, as he did, because he really asked, and he was humiliated by the king, who said, no, you can't, right, in front of also the courtier. So it's devastating, it's terrible. As in fact, what the same Sun King would term as the plus grande gaffe de ma vie, right, so of his life, right, because of what, because of Prince Eugene's exploit. Louis XIV, after some defeats, would ask God, we know that, what he had done so cruel, so wrong to deserve such bloodbath from his side, right? To have refused Prince Eugene, what had become Prince Eugene back in the early eras, right? Eugene resolved to act decisively. Vienna under siege beckoned for aid, which we have seen multiple videos, including ones that describe sort of the Catholic effort behind this and the ceremonies, the rituals in the city, the Papal, Habsburgic, Polish cooperation was really crucial in all this. But everybody contributed to victory. In 1683, Eugene departed Paris, accompanied, by the way, by his cousin Louis Armand de Bourbon, the Prince of Conti. There was the son of the elder Prince of Conti. Conti, these are other, again, naturalized French, Italian families. A prominent Frondeur, by the way, and brother of the Grand Condé, wed to Maria Martinozzi, daughter of Margherita, that was Cardinal Mazarin's sister. You understand how intertwined this cycle was. It was typical also of the French court. Everybody was sort of married into each other's families. As well as, by the way, like in this escape, as we'll learn now, from Paris, because these were, except Eugene, but these other two were actually French officers. So they were actually risking high treason sentence because of essentially passing to a foreign power. Conti's brother, François Louis, the Count of La Roche-sur-Yon, that inherited, in fact, the Conti title in 1685 upon his brother's death. You understand how quickly people died in general, even among the elite, and also often of illness, as you know, and was, in this sense, France's nominee for the Polish crown in 1696. So these guys were playing royalty. You understand how feudally private the sense of European imperial power really was. Conti eventually was compelled to relinquish the candidacy to the Polish crown, but as you know, the Polish-French relations were quite strong, at least up to the point in which Sobieski, that had been elected because of France, decided to basically ally himself with the Habsburgs, and so abandoning the French alliance. Also made a video specifically on that that shift in Polish international policy, right? So deterred by the king's decree forbidding them from leaving France, the cousins retreated, again, because they were French officers. They were noblemen at court. They had this commission. So abandoning, like crossing the boundary into the Holy Roman Empire would have been considered as treason. In fact, what actually happened was that the king sent some soldiers after them, and when they found them, by the way, think how crazy it is, like in 1683, to track down people across Europe. But again, noblemen they didn't really have much with themselves. They were trying to not to leave traces, but they were found. And at that point, the soldiers, by the king's on the king's behalf, literally said, "Look to the Conti, look, if you go, like if you cross over to the Habsburgs, you're done for. So you have too much to lose. Come back to France. And as far as Eugene, we don't give a damn, basically." So the Conti actually agreed, and Eugene was literally like, "Okay, you're so worthless, you can't even go." Like it was the final insult that Eugene took from the Sun King. In fact, he proceeded, of course, without royal approval in general, because that was still somehow bad for France, but he was aided by another cousin. Did you say, what kind of cousins did Prince Eugene have? Like, well, people of the caliber of Louis William, the Margrave of Baden, right, that would really finance this crossing, because literally the guy did not have anything. He had a very scarce sum of money. Eventually, he would be subsidized by his cousin, the Duke of Savoy, as a matter of fact. So things became easier there. The regiment of the Savoy Dragoons is also the unit whose own uniform Prince Eugene was eventually buried with, and so it's a great symbol of the first steps of because for these aristocrats it was all about getting a commission from the main principalities or kingdoms in Europe so that they could have some kind of living off of that, but at the same time fighting with them. It was a very meager, even for this very high nobility, way to live, right? And We explained this in some videos, for example, the one about the Spanish rogue, to show that even, again, noblemen did not really make a great living out of this craft, but they were still the backbone of these this modern militaries. I explained this thoroughly, especially for France, right? Since from the Middle Ages to, in fact, the French Revolution, multiple videos. So with this help from the Margrave of Baden, his relative, Eugene managed through southern Germany to reach the Emperor Leopold of Habsburg in Passau. All right, and by the way, this was an incredibly difficult climate we described in other videos. Leopold was not a very resolute, firm person. He was a sort of introverted, sensual, but irresolute, or at least quite sensitive individual. And if anything, he was under the guidance of Father Daviano, that, as you know, was a bit like the spiritual glue of also the broader international alliance with the papacy, Poland, and managing also the military affairs to a degree. So Eugene reached the emperor at Passau, but this was such a chaotic, and imagine this dark dome of the Turkish crescent rising over Vienna, over the entirety of Central Europe, and this almost apocalyptic reality that, in fact, Eugene was reaching that fully spiritual need of refining his soul. And he met the emperor together with many other, as we were saying, aristocratic youth from famous houses. Again, he didn't have much money on his own, so even as a Savoy Carignano did not really... The situation was so desperate for the emperor, his army, that it's as if the Habsburg neither saw him to a degree. So he rather joined the Dragoon regiment recently bereaved of his brother Louis Julius, that was the one who died at Petronell Carnuntum, led by Johann Donat Heisler von Heitersheim. It's literally in this unit that Eugene fought at Vienna, launching thus his military career by, at the time, pawning jewels to procure his uniform and gear. That's how desperate he actually was. And he would keep remaining for a while in that condition before especially Savoy sent actually some more consistent money. This move, by the way, incensed the Sun King upon discovery, particularly as the emperor likely relished integrating Eugene into his military circle, regardless of his temporary, troubles. Which was still a subtle but worthy affront to his French adversary. As you know, Louis' policy, like the one of the Chambre de Réunion, was essentially eating up Western Germany with the complacency of many Protestant Germans that preferred to have these parts of Germany conquered by the French than supporting the Catholic Habsburgs, which is pretty blipped up, so to say. And all this when the Turks were literally at the gates, right? Just like, Francis I in the previous century, Louis XIV wasn't really doing this because he hated tradition or Catholicism or whatever, but because he loved French so much. Maybe even too much, but being willing to step into eventually a fragmented, pulverized area that would have created in Central Europe had Vienna fallen into Islamic hands. So, bolstered by influential Spanish king at Leopold's court, the young Savoy swiftly ascended the ranks anyway, which is something that mostly took place after the siege of Vienna. If anything, I will make a video about that, and specifically, again, the few that we know, so from Eugene's diary and other sources about what he would have actually done there. Still useful. Again, that's how you start really a military training as a nobleman in Europe. Also, since the Middle Ages, you're entrusted smaller units, smaller missions, and then ever bigger ones. If you're good at it, you will be noticed and promoted, and etc. So that's eventually how Eugene's military genius would eventually manifest together with the Holy Ghost within it. It's important to talk about this stuff because it's not like you hear a story like Eugene. I mean, there are many interesting and beautiful stories when taken individually, but in many ways, it's never fully about, let's say, a model, but even properly the individual capacity. And this is something that you can't measure, but in moments of crisis like this one. I think that the history of Prince Eugene is really an important element of a chain that unites Europe. As I was saying before, you can't really study the passage from 17th to 18th century Europe without focusing not just on the campaigns of Prince Eugene, but probably the context in which he rose through. Right, it's beautiful to study his career because he, again, went through these incredible feats later on, and they are so satisfying because of the losses inflicted on the Ottomans, the large swathes of Central Europe, the Danube taken over by the Habsburgs under the Savoy-Carignano's command. But it's also looking at the origins, right? I think that history should look also very much at the origins, showing how this was possible because a man decided to do so, right? Imagine Prince Eugene had literally followed the ecclesiastical career. Maybe something else would have occurred in this world. Like, we all change history much more than we actually believe. But it's unlikely that Austria would have simply swarmed across the Danubian territories of the Ottoman Empire without a figure of that caliber that really incensed with glory Habsburgic history as literally the greatest commander ever in service of Austria, and in fact the Habsburgic Empire, and really a symbol of, as you understand here, sort of multinational, multilingual background that truly incarnated the elite of Europe, right? This will be especially evident when we'll talk more about Eugene's. Not just, you can of course visit the Belvedere in Vienna and understand the taste of this person and the enormous library that he collected, the love for the arts. And again, he was also a man that, even as a commander, for example, Prince Eugene does not leave much of a legacy in terms of, for example, a military reform of the Habsburgic army. That mostly happened under Maria Theresia. It was at some point even thought she could marry him, but she had already met de Lorraine, and she stuck to him because she was in love, for that matter. And so it's another era. But the Austrian power that we historically know would have not, especially in the 18th century, would have not been the same and so big, especially if Prince Eugene had not been there, right? And his background had not really brought even more prestige because of this provocatorily, as traditionally coherent figure, right? And again, the figure is amazing. Like, it was a guy that literally risked his life in combat, right? Surpassed all those, issues in terms of possible, limitations due to his physicality, etc. And at the same time, looking at how inflexible he was. These were men that, when they saw deserters abandoning the line, would simply grab their pistol and shoot them, right? And it was absolutely normal. That's how a man should behave. And the coherent, the coherence properly of the vision of these people started from the vision of the empire, the vision of the universal Catholic ecumenic power, and not some sort of weird, chaotic, everybody does what they want without any broader purpose in the desolation, in fact, of the same European spiritual values. That's why also the triumph of Austria in these in this, say, in the age, you could argue, of Prince Eugene, is also something that is not adequately celebrated in its primal meaning, right? It's as if, for example, Marlborough is a figure that you have to celebrate, etc. But he also belonged to a background that was affirming something very big as far as English power and, a certain vision of the world and also of nobility from that different background had really expressed. Let's say the way Marlborough, for example, is discussed in greater terms, or at least more prominent ones, more frequent ones, is something that overshadows something incredibly coherent happening with Prince Eugene, and that vestige of, at the end of the day, of medieval world or universal traditional world that the Savoy-Carignano really incarnated together with the Habsburg. So it's potent. It's potent because of his ancestry. It's potent because of the veritable milieu that he was part of. And in general, in fact, for all the set of cultural references that I always say, like Central, Southern Europe, even the Balkan, Eastern one, but even if we're talking France, right, for banally, they should be much more known, also because they were much more central to the picture in many ways than others, and we shouldn't necessarily reason just in terms of expos, but really what were the prominent figures of the era, and the prominent quantities of the era, so to say. So, again, I will surely create also a playlist about Prince Eugene and his exploit, his deeds, that today we just recapped a little bit to just know what we're talking about in a nutshell. We're likely going to talk more about this phase. We'll come back on the 18th century, but also on the 17th, because we made lots of stuff about the 18th at some point recently, but say in the last year or so. But we sort of marginalized other stuff that is equally important from the surroundings, let's say. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.